Welcome audiences to another installment of the Network for New Music Interviews with Composers. Today we have Trevor Weston. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, very well. It's late October and still warm. I'm here for that.
And we're very glad that you are. And we are going to be featuring Juba on our first concert of our 2021-22 season. We're very excited to have you. And what we'd like to do is just to tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you have you started your training at the St. Thomas Choir School, which is of great interest to me because some of my earliest experiences were also in choir. I wonder if you could share with us how that has influenced your creative output.
Yes, so I started singing at St. Thomas Choir School in 5th grade, age of 10. And I can say that a few things in that experience influenced my work as a musician and as a composer. One, because of services every week, we sang a lot of music. I came in contact with a lot of music, a lot of contemporary music. I know that when I was in 5th grade, listening to a piece by Lennox Barkley and falling in love with some section because it was the strangest thing I ever heard, and singing this piece by Michael Tippett called Plebs Angelica, like those sorts of not atonal, but non-tonal sounds were always of interest to me. And the other thing is that singing at St. Thomas and singing in that Anglican tradition meant singing a lot of Anglican chant. And when I was a choir boy, I thought it was boring, but I think in leaving the choir school, I fell in love with chants because the language was so descriptive, and it started my connection between kind of sounds, music, and images or ideas. Because in order to make the psalms sing, as it were, we had to do a lot of expression, and that connection between kind of human emotion and expression or images connected to words probably started there. And I think that early on as a composer, I even mapped out pieces by thinking about images or thinking about textures. That's also connected to the fact that my father was an interior designer, an artist. His brother was a fashion designer. My mother was a wonderful seamstress. She made clothes. So this idea of creativity to me was always like physical objects like paintings or clothes. And in a way, that experience at St. Thomas connected me to kind of the compositional aspect of creativity, kind of using sounds to create forms.
Yes, that's really interesting. And I especially enjoyed reading your artistic statement in that you were talking about music as a suspended reality and a parallel existence, almost in an abstraction. Could you tell us more about that?
So that too is connected to singing at St. Thomas. The choral director at the time was Jerry Hancock, a fantastic musician, organist, and improviser. And during the summers in high school, I had a couple friends, we would go in and acolyte. And for those services especially, Jerry would always improvise the postlude. And his improvisations would just take us someplace else. In fact, I gave a lecture here at Drew at the School of Theology on the Holy Spirit. And I started with a discussion of his improvisations because the other aspect of St. Thomas was this understanding that music wasn't just entertainment. It had this other power to kind of, as part of the liturgy, to kind of take you to that place that is outside of kind of our earthly existence. That's how I kind of interpreted that. And I've always loved music that seemed to me from this other space, the other side, this other dimension, or music that, music that made me feel like I was no longer kind of feeling the ticking of seconds, sometime this other realm. And that had to do with the music that we performed, that had to do with kind of improvisations that I heard. It also had to do with just understanding that music had that role. It wasn't just entertaining, it was important for maybe connecting humans to what we don't understand.
That's really fascinating. Uh, another piece of yours that I really like is Shapeshifter.
Mm.
And I've heard you, when you've spoken about that piece, that you said that was sort of conceived as a combination of deliberate choices and improvisation. And you also said that piece possibly pointed to a new direction for you. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit for us.
So when I started Shapeshifter, I wrote it for Jason Calloway, fantastic cellist. And we're friends. I heard him perform one of the sequenzas by, well, the cello sequenza by Barrio. And so I thought, oh, I'll write a piece for Jason that really is not just a solo piece, but like the sequenzas, it kind of represents a character, thinking maybe more like the trombone sequenza. And when I started it, I had some idea about a shapeshifter or really a mechanical um, being, a mechanical thing that is trying to communicate. Because my thoughts were about the futurists and what they predicted, and the fact that a lot of our contemporary pop music uses a lot of kind of noise sounds. But I thought, what would it be like to try to create music from the computer's point of view, or from the machine's point of view, but the machine not being able to do so. And then when I started, the blues came out. And so then I don't know how that happened. It happened. So with the blues coming out, I had this, and I like to do this, I created this problem to solve. How do I create a piece that represents the blues and also what sounds like a machine trying to express something to humans?
Mm.
And then it became a larger issue, like, well, what if someone like Robert Johnson came back to life and heard all of this blues informed music, but no one knew who he was or any of his compatriots? He might be a little angry. And so it became a piece that somehow dealt with all of that. You know, the machine part is a shapeshifter, something that could change its form. But the angry bluesman, which is a subtitle, is connected to kind of the fact that we live in a world where, one, machines are really important. Machines help us create music and are connected to how we create music. And that music has its roots in these individuals who we don't normally talk about or are aware of. So my challenge was to try to push myself to imagine the evolution of a piece by a non-human. That was the challenge. And in hip hop, you know, DJing, hip hop started with DJs who were really the master musicians, coming up with music that really represented organizing noise and sounds from other pieces of music, which is, you know, kind of music concrete with, in a way, with turntables. But they created these sounds that are always kind of very industrial, mechanical sounds. So I thought, that's what I'm shooting for. What if, like, the machine is somehow connected to that tradition? And how do you create textures? Well, the textures have to be not gradual changes, which is what might be more human, but more kind of episodic changes, from this thing to that thing, because maybe that's the difference between a human doing something and a machine not knowing how to gradually go from something to the next thing. So that's really what I thought about.
That's really interesting. And I hope that'll inspire people to listen to Shapeshifter.
Mhm.
Another piece of yours that I really like is A.N.S.
Oh, yes, sir.
A new sound. And you know what I particularly like is the Duke Ellington quote that you put there. That, you know, if I could read this,
Sure.
this is Ellington saying, "So this is my view on the race for space. We'll never get it until we Americans collectively and individually get us a new sound of harmony, brotherly love, common respect, and consideration for the dignity and freedom of men." And I find both that concept and the music, you know, incredibly interesting and really poignant. One of the things that interests me about that piece is that piece has two versions, doesn't it?
Yes, so that piece was commissioned by Elizabeth Jansen, and she wanted me to write a piece for flute and marimba. And I'm forgetting the marimba, Kyle, I'm forgetting his last name. So they wanted a piece that addressed civil rights in some way. And years ago, I was asked by Ollie Wilson to co-author a chapter on Duke Ellington in the, um, I guess, Cambridge Companion to Duke Ellington. And this chapter was specifically about Duke Ellington as a cultural icon. So Ollie Wilson said, why don't you look at the Duke Ellington Companion or Reader, sorry, which is a collection of articles by Duke Ellington about Duke Ellington. And I found this unpublished essay that's in that collection called The Race for Space. And his main point was that after Sputnik happened, he said the reason why the Soviets are beating us is that they're not wasting their energy, their laws in keeping people down like we do with segregation. And we're focused on keeping people separate instead of focusing our energies on these other things. And that's why we won't be able to do that until we start refocusing and, as you kind of read in the quote, understand that we're all equals and we need to live together. And so I thought, I want to start with that because that's such a great thought, even though obviously we made it to moon after that. But his idea that our inability to see humanity in other humans or other citizens in our country is why we're losing in the development of our kind of scientific investigations.
Mm.
So I kind of challenged myself to like, well, what is the new sound? And that's kind of what the piece is. And this piece of kind of, for me, and I do this a lot, an opportunity to explore some harmonies that I've used, but trying to organize them in a different way.
Mm.
And so that was the original version. And speaking to Liz, she said, I was thinking, wanted to know if you had a solo flute piece. I said, no, I don't. But I've always thought, and I told her this, I always thought that this piece might work better for piano. And she said, I think so too. So I ended up doing a piano version. And that's why there's a second version.
And as I mentioned, I really like the concept of it. But I find it interesting too that it has two versions, because the piece that we're programming, Juba for string quartet, also has two versions. Could you tell us a little bit about the origin of Juba for us?
So Juba has an even more complicated origin story in that I was connected to a project that was going to look at the history of people of African descent who worked on rice plantations in South Carolina. I lived in Charleston for 9 years, or Charleston area. I taught at the College of Charleston. And it was going to be like a cantata or an oratorio, actually a requiem. And there were delays because one of the creators of this project had some health issues and things were pushed back. And one of the presenters said, well, I need something since we're going to do this piece. Could you write a piece for string orchestra? So I did. I wrote a piece that I thought might be the overture, the beginning instrumental music to this longer piece. And that was a piece of a different name called same music, Unmarked, Unmourned, oh gosh, I'm forgetting, there are 3 U's. So I wrote that piece and I thought, Trevor, you're writing a piece for string orchestra. What if they don't do the piece because there are so many things in flux? You should write a string quartet version of this. So as soon as I finished it, I arranged it for a string quartet, probably like a week or 2 later. And so that's why there are 2 versions of the piece. And then the project fell apart. And so they wanted me to change the name. So I changed the name. And I helped to reconstruct the piano concerto by Florence Price. I'm aware of her music. And in her Symphony in E, there's a Juba dance. R. Nathaniel Dett has a Juba for piano. I've known that Juba is a word used for the dance music that people of African descent did in the 19th century. And in my piece, there are places where the performers have to stamp their feet, and they use fiddle and banjo music, which was they were the instruments of choice for this dance music of the 19th century. So that's how I came to that name. And I came to the quartet because I really thought maybe this is something that I can send around. It's easier to get a string quartet to perform this than a string orchestra.
Yeah, you have a lot of really great techniques involved in that, in addition to the foot stomping, such as the wide vibrato that you mark almost graphically in the score, which is not characteristic of Western classical string playing. And also you do some really fascinating things with the dynamics as well, like the playing with the sound envelopes and the crescendos that are really subtle and poetic as well.
So that you can, I can also say that this piece represents my years ago encounter with traditional African American religious singing. So when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I was taken to, a friend of mine took me to a Baptist church in Oakland. And it's the first time I'd ever heard what's called lining out a hymn. It's the first time I ever heard that sort of singing. And so all of the wide vibratos are an attempt to imitate that vocal tradition, and the really kind of upfront, kind of visceral, emotional expression that is part of that tradition. And the fact that there might be a leader, but there are people who are also kind of individually responding in real time. And those kind of subtle little kind of coming in and coming out in response was something I tried to capture. And to be honest, it took me, what, like 2 decades to figure out how to do that effectively, so that it didn't sound like I was copying something but didn't understand it. I thought that in Juba, since this piece was supposed to be to honor the contributions of people of African descent to American music, I wanted to represent 2 very strong traditions, which is the instrumental tradition and the kind of choral tradition. And that choral tradition, you know, is actually agnostic. It became religious. It also went to the blues. And also specifically, I forever have been in love with this flute melody from Burundi, from a traditional recording. So I use that melody and the scale associated with that melody as the opening statement in the violin. So the piece is really like a journey through the transformation of an African heritage, the musical legacy, into this fiddle and banjo music, and also to this what's called lining out a hymn, kind of religious vocal tradition.
Yeah, because that's the last section after the outrage. You go to the
That's right.
lining out hymn and then prayer.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And then the very end, because the piece had to do with Charleston, there are a lot of tremolos. And to me, that's the humidity. That's kind of that atmosphere where you can touch kind of the water in the air. And I wanted to represent that. I think most people use the word lazy kind of heat, but it's not lazy, it's just intense in a different way. Like there's always, I think my feeling in 95% humidity is that the air now is active all the time. Like you can feel it being active in a very subtle way. And that's how I wanted to represent that.
Yeah, guys, I wanted to ask you about that ending with that the solo cello sort of brings out the whole quartet.
Yeah, my idea is kind of like you're there and it's like, whew, that was my feeling. Like you can't do anything but kind of contemplate and just try to stay cool.
Yeah, well, you've mentioned Ollie Wilson a number of times, and I presume you encountered him at UC Berkeley in your time there.
Yeah, so he was my major, advisor, mentor when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley. Fantastic composer, fantastic scholar. One of the really important changes in my life was studying music composition with him and kind of seeing how he incorporated elements of African American music in his compositions. And also he teaches a course in African American, or taught a course in African American music history. And taking that course, it was, and I told him this, it was kind of like seeing the Rosetta Stone of how African American music works, because he has, as he lists, like 6 conceptual approaches, like characteristics that are in music by African Americans that connects to how Africans from West Africa approach writing their music. And they're not specific. It's not like, oh, you have to use this note and this note. It's more like an approach, like using call and response, not just in, you know, choir solo, but also even how the melodies are created. Like that idea is, you know, important. Or the fact that physical body motion, when people perform music, they're usually moving, they're dancing. You know, traditional gospel choirs, the movement is part of the music. In fact, if you watch some choirs, before they sing a note, the director directs them to move, which means the movement isn't something else. It is part of what happens. And studying with him, and, you know, fortunate to have his support for so many years, had a huge influence on my work as a composer. And he also promoted this idea of composer being both a scholar. So I already had an interest in history. I was a double major in music and history in undergrad. So a lot of my pieces, as you've heard, have some historical or some research component, because those are things which have always interested me.
And now you're the professor and you're teaching at Drew University, and
Yes.
you know, having a really important and influential role. I wanted to get your, since you gave us such a wonderful artistic statement, sort of your statement about the role of the composer in the 21st century that embraces both the past and the present.
Well, I think that what I do as a professor is, in a way, humanize what it means to be a composer. And I don't say that to believe that we are somehow some demigods, but I do believe that when people think of Mozart as an example, I don't think they think of him as a human. They think of him as this thing. And, or Bach, or Duke Ellington, maybe. And the Duke Ellington might be even more important, because I think in this culture, because America has such a complicated history with classical music and how it fits in. I mean, it's always, I think it's either intentionally or unintentionally treated as imported. So it's always better over there because that's the origin. And so as a professor who is also a composer and who teaches composition, I feel that one of my roles is to say that every composer represented who they were and where they were living at that time, and not necessarily what most people believe is walking around having deep thoughts about only things that aren't connected to their existence. So I have composition classes tomorrow. And, you know, one of the things I like to tell students, because early on, I can tell that they want to write something serious or write something that is a composition, as opposed to focusing on, well, how do you hear music? What do you want it to do? I also teach in the MAP program and pre-college program at Juilliard on Saturdays, and I have 3 students in the MAP program that I'm teaching composition to. And it was amazing, because they're younger than, you know, teenagers in college, to say, hey, you know, you need to write things that you like. Like that was a revelation, you know, because you're doing something serious like writing music. We kind of forget that, you know, when Bach wrote his pieces, everyone knew those chorale tunes. Those were like the hometown tunes. Those weren't some, sad to say, I teach theory, these old melodies that I need to know because I'm doing music theory. It was connected to what everyone heard. And that connection is something that I want to do with my students, meaning making sure that they're aware that what composition is, reacting to who you are and where you are in the world with the sounds that you like to communicate something to people or to
Indeed.
document something.
Mhm. Yeah. And although we're very pleased to produce and perform Juba on our upcoming concert, I'm also curious, what are you working on now?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I can't make the concert because a friend of mine who's a choral director at Harvard is doing a piece called Ashes I wrote for choir in response to 9/11. And they're doing a whole 9/11 memorial, like 20th year event. So I'm going to that. I'm working on I'm working on actually a guitar piece right now. I'm almost done for solo guitar. I'm kind of my first piece for solo guitar. And I'm also working on a cantata for the Washington Bach soloist. The director, Dana Marsh, and I both went to St. Thomas Choir School together. Dana's a fantastic musician, fantastic scholar, and he wanted me to write a piece in response to another Bach cantata. And we decided on 201, which is the cantata about Phoebus and Pan competing and Midas picking Pan. And so I'm collaborating with a friend, Leah Maudry. She's writing the libretto. And so we're writing a piece that is in response to that issue of like, what is music or what is good music? And that is for early instruments, and that will be for next fall. And also, I was picked to be one of the first emerging Black composers for this project with the San Francisco Symphony. So I'm writing a piece for them for next fall. So those are the things that I'm working on.
Wow, it sounds like a really busy schedule
Is
between.
it, yeah, it's I articulating that is a little scary, but that's the plan. So yes.
I'm so grateful for you for taking this time and want to invite everyone to hear Juba by Trevor Weston on our first concert, which happens on 7 November, which is a Sunday at 3 p.m. at the Icebox Project Space. So thank you so much, Trevor.
Thank you. Thank you very much.